Ethan Harper woke to the soft hum of the city below, the Manhattan skyline stretching out like a glittering promise of everything he had conquered. From his penthouse perched atop the tallest tower, he could see Central Park, a green jewel in the heart of the city, and beyond it, the restless Atlantic glinting under the early morning sun. At 38, Ethan was a self-made tech billionaire, the visionary behind Harper Technologies, a company that had redefined virtual reality and made his name synonymous with innovation and wealth. Every corner of his life was meticulously curated. The penthouse was a gallery of rare art, sculptures that caught light in unexpected ways, and furniture designed by the world's most exclusive designers. Even his morning coffee, brewed by a machine that cost more than a modest apartment, tasted like victory. To outsiders, Ethan's life seemed perfect, a life of comfort, influence, and admiration. But behind the polished exterior, there was a careful distance, a fortress built to keep the world at bay. Personal connections had always been transactional, friendships, business. Love, when it appeared, had been filtered through the lens of convenience and timing. He moved through his morning ritual with practiced precision. A run on the private gym terrace overlooking the city, a quick dip in the infinity pool, and a call to his assistant to review the day's schedule. Investors, board meetings, product launches, each item a stepping stone in the empire he had built. Yet, as he looked at his reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows, a fleeting thought whispered in his mind. Had he ever truly lived outside the numbers? The truth was Ethan thrived in control. Risk excited him, but only if it could be measured, predicted, and leveraged. Emotions were secondary, relationships, optional. And yet, somewhere deep beneath the layers of strategy and ambition, there was a quiet longing, a curiosity about a life that wasn't defined by profits and quarterly earnings. By 9 a.m., Ethan was already in his sleek black sedan, gliding through the streets of Manhattan. The world knew him as a genius, a force, a man who could bend markets to his will. Today he was preparing for the unveiling of Harper Technologies' newest VR platform, a project that could potentially double the company's valuation overnight. Analysts were watching, journalists were hovering, and competitors were calculating their next move. Ethan, confident as ever, smiled at the thought. He had conquered the tech world once. He would do it again. Yet, as the city pulsed around him, with its honking taxis and hurried pedestrians, there was a subtle tension in the air, unnoticed by the casual observer. A missed call from a senior partner. An email marked urgent that he skimmed and dismissed. A fleeting doubt in the back of his mind, quickly buried under confidence. Everything was in place and nothing could go wrong, or so he believed. The life of Ethan Harper was a monument to success, a carefully constructed narrative of power, control, and wealth. But as the sun climbed higher, painting the city gold, a storm he couldn't foresee was already stirring. One day, one moment, would come to challenge everything he thought he knew about security, influence, and the true meaning of success. Today, Ethan was untouchable. Tomorrow, the world as he knew it would shift beneath his feet. Ethan's day began like any other, packed, precise, and brimming with potential. But the first crack appeared in an innocuous way, buried among the hundreds of emails demanding his attention. A flagged message from Harper Technologies' chief financial officer caught his eye. Urgent, liquidity issue, immediate action required. Ethan smirked. Issues like this were routine, part of the rhythm of running a multi-billion-dollar company. He opened the email, expecting the usual minor discrepancies or system glitches that could be corrected with a few calls and a confident decision. But this was not routine. The email outlined a critical error in the company's latest investment maneuver. A massive, leveraged acquisition of a smaller VR startup had gone awry. The expected revenue projections had been overstated, legal documents had minor but consequential errors, and the partner company's financial stability was questionable at best. The result? A potential loss of hundreds of millions if action wasn't taken immediately. Ethan's pulse quickened, but he reassured himself. Mistakes could be corrected. He was Ethan Harper. Problems bowed before him. By 10 a.m. he was on the phone with lawyers, bankers, and the CFO, executing a flurry of calls and virtual meetings. Each second seemed heavier than the last, but he was in control, he always was. Or so he thought. As the morning unfolded, the cracks multiplied. A key investor withdrew their commitment, citing unexpected market conditions. Another partner demanded renegotiation of terms. Social media chatter about Harper Technologies' volatile new investment began to trend. Ethan's inbox filled with messages marked urgent from journalists, analysts, and shareholders. The headlines weren't there yet, but the momentum was unstoppable. Then just before noon the first real blow landed. A live call from a major financial news network requested an on-air statement. Ethan agreed, confident in his ability to command the narrative. But the reporter's questions were pointed, sharp, and relentless, probing into the failed acquisition and the apparent lack of oversight. The broadcast went live, and for the first time, Ethan felt the familiar armor of control begin to falter. By early afternoon, panic had begun to ripple through Harper Technologies' offices. Employees whispered in corridors, clients called frantically, and investors started to panic. The stock price, previously rock solid, began a sharp decline. Ethan watched the numbers fall in real time, his stomach twisting. This was new territory, the kind of rapid, cascading disaster he had studied in theory but never experienced personally. He retreated to his office, shutting the door behind him, and tried to think. Every decision he made seemed to ignite another fire. Every phone call brought another crisis. The luxury of wealth offered no shield against the avalanche now barreling toward him. As he paced the room, Ethan realized with chilling clarity that for all his expertise, all his preparation, he was unarmed against the speed and ferocity of systemic failure. And then the personal element arrived, the final insult. A text from his private accountant, bank accounts frozen, major legal claims filed, emergency measures engaged. The realization hit him like a freight train. This was no temporary setback. His liquidity, his assets, everything he had built over decades, was unraveling in hours. Ethan sat down, uncharacteristically silent, staring at the skyline that had felt like a crown of triumph just that morning. The city below continued to pulse with life, indifferent to the storm consuming his world. For the first time he confronted the terrifying truth. Wealth, power, and influence, all the things he had believed defined him, could disappear in a single day. And as the sun rose higher, the day that had begun with promise now carried the weight of a collapse that would redefine Ethan Harper forever. By mid-afternoon, the storm that had quietly started in Ethan's inbox had erupted into a full-scale public disaster. Social media posts about Harper Technologies were now trending across every platform. Tweets dissected the failed acquisition with ruthless precision. Analysts questioned Ethan's competence, former partners publicly distanced themselves, and the stock market punished his company with every tick downward. The world that had once admired him now scrutinized him, judgment swift and unforgiving. Ethan walked through the once bustling office, now eerily quiet. Employees clustered in small groups, whispering, their faces a mixture of fear, confusion, and betrayal. The sense of invincibility that had always defined him was gone, replaced by a gnawing, hollow panic. He overheard a colleague mutter, "I've never seen him like this. He's human after all." Ethan didn't respond, he couldn't. Not yet. Calls came in relentlessly. Creditors demanding explanations. Legal teams pushing for urgent strategy sessions. Investors threatening lawsuits. With every phone that rang, the walls seemed to close in. The luxurious penthouse that had once been his sanctuary now felt like a gilded cage, each window a reminder of a world that no longer recognized his authority. And then came the personal blows. Calls from family members he hadn't spoken to in years, each one tinged with judgment or concern, each one a mirror reflecting the fragility of the empire he had built. His assistant hesitated before passing him a call from his younger sister. "Ethan, is it true? Are you broke?" The word struck harder than any financial report. Broke. It was final, almost primal in its simplicity. For someone who had measured life in billions and contracts, being reduced to a single devastating word was unbearable. He ended the call and retreated to the office balcony, looking out over the city that had witnessed his rise. The skyline was no longer a symbol of dominance. It was indifferent, beautiful, and merciless. The city didn't pause for him. The world didn't stop when his fortune evaporated. It kept moving, relentless and uncaring. Ethan felt small, exposed, and achingly alone. As the hours passed, Ethan tried to assemble a plan. He reached out to his closest advisors, seeking lifelines, desperate for solutions. But every path he considered was blocked, complicated, or already closed. The partnerships he had relied on for years had dissolved, the collateral he had counted on had vanished, and the legal consequences of mismanaged investments loomed like a storm on the horizon. Each conversation confirmed the harsh truth. He had miscalculated, and the miscalculations were catastrophic. By evening, the first wave of media coverage hit. Headlines screamed across screens, "Tech tycoon Ethan Harper faces collapse. Billionaire's empire crumbles in 24 hours, Harper Technologies in freefall." The headlines cut deeper than any conversation with a lawyer or disgruntled investor. For the first time, Ethan realized that this wasn't just about money, it was about reputation, legacy, identity. His name, once synonymous with power and precision, was now associated with failure and chaos. The solitude of the penthouse pressed down on him as night fell. The city lights twinkled below, mocking in their constancy, while Ethan sat silently, grappling with the enormity of what had happened. The fortune he had amassed over decades, the companies he had built, the image of perfection and control, it all felt like smoke slipping through his fingers. And yet, even in this chaos, a strange clarity emerged. Stripped of wealth, stripped of status, stripped of the illusions that had sustained him, Ethan confronted the simplest, most human truth. He was still alive. The world had not ended. Failure, for the first time, was real and unavoidable, but it was also, paradoxically, liberating. Without the weight of billions, without the expectation of perfection, there was room to breathe, to rethink, to rebuild. As he stared out over the city, Ethan Harper finally allowed himself to feel something he hadn't in years. Fear, raw and unfiltered, but also a glimmer of possibility. Tomorrow, he realized, would not be about recovering his fortune. It would be about facing the consequences, embracing the collapse, and discovering who he was without it. And perhaps, just perhaps, he might find out that what he truly needed was something money could never buy. The morning after the collapse, Ethan woke to the silence of his penthouse, the city humming indifferently below. The phone had stopped ringing, but the silence was no relief. It was a reminder that no one depended on him now, and no one was waiting for him to solve the mess he had created. Even the apartment, once a symbol of his success, felt alien and hollow. First came the personal fallout. His closest friends who had once celebrated lavish victories with him, now avoided calls and messages. Lunch invitations disappeared from calendars. Congratulatory emails were replaced by careful distance. Ethan realized that wealth had been the glue holding many relationships together. Without it, the bonds were brittle, and in a single day they shattered. Then came the family. His mother called first, voice trembling. "Ethan, are you okay?" The question felt simultaneously tender and accusatory. She had always treated his success as proof of his worth, and now she was grappling with the truth. Her son, the golden child, was human, fallible, and broken. He reassured her, though even he wasn't sure if he believed his own words. The most painful confrontation was with his younger sister, Clara. She had always resented the way he overshadowed her, and now she had the upper hand. "So, what now, Ethan? How does it feel to be like the rest of us?" The sarcasm cut sharper than any boardroom critique. Ethan had no defense. He could only sit, nod, and absorb the weight of reality. His life, once carefully curated and controlled, now lay in pieces. At the office, chaos reigned. Managers tried to salvage projects, employees scrambled to protect their positions, and the legal department fielded frantic calls from creditors. Ethan stepped into the headquarters not as a commanding CEO, but as a spectator of his own empire crumbling. Every meeting was a reminder of mistakes, missed signals, and overconfidence. Former allies turned cautious, hesitant to act without clarity. Every door he opened seemed to lead to another problem he had caused. Yet in this maelstrom, unexpected allies emerged. A junior executive, whom Ethan had overlooked for years, stepped forward with a clear-headed plan to stabilize operations. "Sir, we can mitigate some losses if we act immediately on these accounts," she said, her voice calm amidst the panic. Ethan listened, surprised at how competent and fearless she was. For the first time in decades, he realized that leadership wasn't about commanding everyone, it was about trusting capable people to step up when you falter. By late afternoon, he had a brief encounter with the media. Reporters swarmed, cameras flashing, microphones thrust toward him. Questions came rapid fire. How did it happen? Is this the end of Harper Technologies? Were there warning signs? Ethan, with a rare humility, said nothing definitive. Instead, he chose silence, realizing that any answer he gave would be scrutinized and weaponized. For once, he understood the power of restraint over bravado. As the day ended, Ethan returned to the penthouse, exhausted but strangely awake. Alone, he reflected on the lessons he had learned in mere hours. The empire he had built on ambition, power, and wealth had crumbled, but the remnants of his life, the people he had ignored, the values he had sidelined, the connections he had neglected, were still salvageable. Ethan realized he had been living in a bubble, insulated by fortune and status. The collapse had torn that bubble apart, exposing him to raw reality, failure, vulnerability, and the chance for redemption. It was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. He no longer had the illusion of invincibility, but he had clarity. He understood that the next chapter wouldn't be about regaining everything he lost, it would be about rebuilding something that truly mattered. That evening, as the city lights flickered outside his windows, Ethan made a decision. He would reach out to those he had neglected, friends, family, even former rivals. He would start small, with honest conversations, apologies, and actions that reflected sincerity rather than power. And perhaps, amidst the rubble of lost wealth, he might discover a richer life. One built not on billions but on resilience, trust, and human connection. For the first time since the fall, Ethan Harper felt the stirrings of hope. Tomorrow he would face the consequences head-on, but tonight he allowed himself to simply breathe, to exist in the strange, unfamiliar freedom that came from losing everything. The morning sun filtered through the dusty blinds of Ethan's penthouse, casting long, uneven stripes across the empty floor. He sat at the edge of his bed, sipping a bitter black coffee, feeling the first true pangs of accountability settle in. Today would not be about numbers, graphs, or stock portfolios. It would be about people, the ones he had ignored while chasing success. Ethan's first call was to Clara. He rehearsed every word in his mind, the awkwardness twisting like a knot in his stomach. When her voice finally answered, sharp and suspicious, he swallowed hard. Claire. I know I've been absent in ways that matter. I can't fix the past, but I want to be here now if you'll let me. There was silence on the line. Then slowly she spoke. I don't know if I can believe you yet, Ethan. But I'm listening. It was not forgiveness, but it was a start, and that was all he could hope for. Next came the employees, many of whom had been loyal for years, only to watch him falter spectacularly. Ethan walked into the office with nothing but humility and an open door. The junior executive, Claire, greeted him with a nod, her confidence unchanged by his fall. Sir, we have a plan for stabilizing the accounts. But it'll take coordination, honesty, and patience. Ethan nodded, realizing that true leadership now required listening rather than commanding. He spent hours meeting each department, acknowledging mistakes and asking for input on solutions. For the first time, the office didn't feel like a kingdom to rule, it felt like a team to guide. The hardest conversation came with his mother. She had always measured his worth in achievements, and now her voice trembled with both concern and reproach. Ethan, I always believed in you. But do you understand what it means to fail this hard? He took her hands in his, feeling their fragility and warmth. Yes, Mom. And I also understand what it means to rebuild with integrity. I want you to see me not as a man who lost, but as a man who learns and grows. For the first time, he saw her eyes soften, hope flickering where judgment had lingered. In the evening, he walked the city streets aimlessly, allowing the urban hum to fill the spaces where wealth and status had once dominated. He noticed street vendors, struggling artists, and families on worn-out benches. He had spent so long insulated by money that he had forgotten what it felt like to see life in its raw, unfiltered form. There was humility in witnessing the resilience of others, a lesson he absorbed quietly. Ethan also reached out to former rivals, people he had once sought to overpower. One by one, phone calls and emails went out. I know I've made mistakes, and I want to find a way forward that's fair to all of us. Some replied with skepticism, others with cautious willingness. But the conversations opened doors to collaboration he hadn't imagined when he was blinded by ambition. The fall, he realized, had stripped away pride and revealed opportunity in its place. By nightfall, Ethan returned to his penthouse, a notebook in hand. He listed the people he wanted to reconnect with, the relationships to rebuild, and the steps needed to regain trust. Each name carried weight, each action a promise. For the first time in years, he was not running from responsibility, he was embracing it fully and unflinchingly. That night, he allowed himself a small moment of peace. The city lights twinkled like scattered stars below, and for the first time in weeks, Ethan Harper felt grounded. He understood now that rebuilding was not about regaining wealth, it was about reconstructing the bonds that truly mattered: family, friends, colleagues, and even himself. As he drifted to sleep, he resolved that tomorrow would be about action, not regret. He would show up, he would listen, and he would begin to earn back the trust and respect that could not be bought. Losing everything had been a storm, yes, but storms, he realized, sometimes left the clearest skies in their wake. The following morning, Ethan stepped into the small cafe near his apartment, a place he had never noticed before. The smell of roasted coffee beans and freshly baked bread felt grounding, a stark contrast to the sterile luxury of his former life. He had arranged to meet a former competitor, Lila Moreno, a tech entrepreneur whose company he had tried to outmaneuver countless times. Now, standing across from her, he felt an unfamiliar humility, the tension between them replaced by a cautious curiosity. I didn't think I'd ever see you here, Lila said, a wry smile tugging at her lips. I didn't think I'd ever need your help either, Ethan admitted, his voice steady. But we both know what losing everything teaches you. I want to find a way we can help each other rebuild. She studied him, measuring sincerity in the angles of his face and the steadiness of his tone. After a long pause, she nodded. All right, Harper. Let's talk solutions. They spent hours brainstorming, sketching ideas on napkins and debating strategies over cappuccinos. Ethan realized that collaboration with someone he had once viewed as an enemy opened doors he hadn't considered. Their conversation was electric, full of ideas and possibilities that surpassed even his pre-fall ambitions. For the first time, he felt the thrill of creation without the burden of ego, pure innovation in its rawest form. Later that day, Ethan met with Marcus, a loyal former employee who had been quietly running operations while Ethan's empire had faltered. Marcus had been skeptical at first but had agreed to a lunch meeting after seeing Ethan's outreach to colleagues and competitors alike. You're serious about this, aren't you? Marcus asked as they shared sandwiches in the park. Ethan nodded, appreciating Marcus's directness. More than ever. I can't rebuild the company alone. I need people I can trust, people who understand the stakes and are willing to innovate, not just survive. Marcus smiled faintly. Then let's get to work. As the day progressed, Ethan reached out to other key allies, investors, former board members, even a handful of journalists he had once antagonized. He explained his new approach candidly: honesty, accountability, and a commitment to long-term sustainability rather than short-term gains. Reactions were mixed, some skeptical, others cautiously supportive, but every conversation reinforced his belief that transparency could be more powerful than intimidation. By late afternoon, Ethan returned to his apartment exhausted but invigorated. The once quiet streets now felt alive with potential. He sat by the window watching the city bustle below, and reflected on the connections he had rekindled and the new partnerships forming. For the first time, he understood that losing everything had stripped away his illusions and revealed the core of his capabilities. Not dominance, but adaptability, empathy, and resilience. That evening, a surprising message arrived from Clara, the person he had feared would never forgive him. Ethan, I saw the way you interacted today, the way you listened, the way you acted without expecting anything. I want to help. Let's meet tomorrow. Ethan's chest tightened with relief and cautious optimism. Rebuilding bridges was not easy, but moments like these made every effort worthwhile. Before going to bed, he called his mother, updating her on the day's progress. Her voice, once filled with doubt, now carried a note of encouragement. I'm proud of you, Ethan. Not for what you're rebuilding, but for who you're becoming. The words settled in his heart, a reassurance he hadn't realized he had been craving. As the city lights flickered and the night deepened, Ethan Harper felt a shift within himself. The journey ahead was daunting, full of uncertainty, potential setbacks, and difficult choices. But for the first time since losing everything, he felt equipped to face it. He was not alone, and he was not defeated. The storm had passed, leaving clarity and unexpected allies in its wake. Ethan finally allowed himself to sleep with a measure of peace, knowing that tomorrow would bring more challenges, and more opportunities to prove that losing everything could be the beginning of something far greater. The next morning, Ethan walked into the office space he had managed to rent temporarily, a modest suite with sunlight streaming through tall windows and a view of the city streets below. He had brought with him only the essentials: a laptop, a notebook filled with scribbles, and the energy of someone determined to start anew. Today was about first moves, small yet deliberate steps toward reclaiming not just his business, but his identity as a leader who had once thrived on control. He called an emergency video conference with a handful of loyal investors who had remained cautiously supportive through the turmoil. Ethan knew their patience was thinning, their confidence fragile. I know you've all seen the headlines, he began, his voice steady but infused with vulnerability. Yes, I lost control of my company. Yes, it's been a public failure. But I've spent the last week learning, recalibrating, and building a team that can take us from crisis to opportunity. He outlined a step-by-step plan for stabilizing the company's cash flow, reducing unnecessary expenditures, and launching a new product line designed for long-term resilience rather than instant profit. Reactions were mixed as expected. One investor expressed doubt. Ethan, this is ambitious. Are you sure you can pull it off? Ethan met the question with calm conviction. I've been forced to see what really matters. I'm not just trying to reclaim a fortune. I'm building a foundation that can survive storms, mistakes, and change. And I'm not doing it alone. I have a team that believes in this vision as much as I do. By the end of the meeting, he had secured tentative commitments from enough investors to begin execution. Afterward, he turned to the team he had assembled over the last few days, including Lila Moreno and Marcus. "We start with clarity," Ethan said, pacing in front of a whiteboard covered in notes and flowcharts. "Every department, every decision, every dollar needs to serve the bigger goal: sustainable growth. Mistakes of the past won't define us. Adaptability will." Lila nodded, impressed by the clarity and focus he displayed despite the chaos surrounding him. Marcus, usually reserved, added, "Let's just make sure we communicate every step. Transparency will be our edge." The rest of the morning was consumed with restructuring priorities, reassigning responsibilities, and negotiating quick wins that would demonstrate momentum to both the public and their stakeholders. Ethan felt the familiar adrenaline of business strategy, yet it was tempered with newfound patience and awareness. Every decision now carried weight not just for profit but for trust. The trust of investors, employees, and most importantly, the people he had alienated during his obsession with power. By late afternoon, Ethan took a break and walked to a nearby park, pausing on a bench to watch families laughing and children chasing frisbees. He thought about the connections he had begun to rebuild: the former competitor who had agreed to partner, the employees who had not abandoned him, and even Clara, whose cautious forgiveness offered the possibility of redemption. He realized that success now wasn't measured solely in dollars or stock prices, but in relationships that could withstand failure. Back in the office, he received an unexpected call from a journalist he had once tried to suppress. "Ethan, I know this sounds unusual, but I want to cover your comeback story. Real story, not the headlines. Are you interested?" Ethan hesitated. His instinct was to decline, but then he remembered the lessons of the past week. Honesty and transparency could be more powerful than fear and secrecy. "Yes," he replied after a pause. "Let's do it." As night fell, Ethan sat at his desk reviewing the day's progress. The team had implemented the first phase of their plan, investors were cautiously optimistic, and media attention promised to reshape the narrative surrounding his downfall. More importantly, Ethan felt a quiet satisfaction that came not from control, but from purpose. Each small step forward reaffirmed that losing everything had been the catalyst he needed to rediscover clarity, integrity, and drive. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to feel hope. Not fragile, fleeting hope, but something grounded in action, accountability, and support. Tomorrow he would continue the process, building trust, reinforcing structures, and proving that even a man who had lost it all could rise again. But tonight, he would savor this moment, the first day of a comeback built on lessons learned, alliances formed, and a deeper understanding of what it truly meant to lead. The following morning, Ethan walked into the office feeling the weight of anticipation. Overnight, the journalist's article had gone live, painting a vivid portrait of his journey from billionaire to bankruptcy, and now the painstaking effort to reclaim his life and career. The article was sympathetic yet unflinching, highlighting both his failures and the courage it took to face them publicly. As the news spread across social media, the reactions were instantaneous: admiration from some, skepticism from others, and a flood of messages from people he hadn't heard from in years. By mid-morning, the office phone rang continuously, a mix of journalists, investors, and former colleagues. Ethan realized the spotlight he had long avoided was now unavoidable. Each call carried potential risks, but also opportunities to reshape the narrative. His team, Lila and Marcus, worked frantically to manage communications, drafting statements, scheduling interviews, and ensuring that every message reinforced transparency, responsibility, and forward momentum. Then came a call from a national morning show. "Ethan Carver?" the producer asked. "We want to bring you on live. Millions of viewers, your story, your words." Ethan hesitated. Live television had always been a high-pressure environment, one he had once dominated with charisma and confidence. But this was different. This was about authenticity, not performance. After a brief consultation with Lila, he agreed, understanding that vulnerability could be his greatest strength. The live interview began. Cameras focused, lights bright, and millions of eyes on him. Ethan took a deep breath. "I made mistakes," he began honestly, his tone measured but warm. "I lost everything, yes. But losing everything forced me to see what truly matters: integrity, relationships, and responsibility. Rebuilding isn't just about money, it's about trust, accountability, and proving that setbacks can be a catalyst for growth." The host pressed on, challenging him about past arrogance, the lifestyle that had led to his downfall, and whether he could realistically regain investors' confidence. Ethan met each question with a combination of humility and clarity. "I understand the skepticism," he said. I've been there myself. But I'm not asking people to trust the headlines, I'm asking them to trust the actions I'm taking every single day. After the interview, Ethan returned to the office to find messages from new investors expressing interest in supporting his next moves. But there were also critics, public comments, opinion pieces questioning whether he could sustain the comeback. Some of the criticism stung, but Ethan recognized its value. Scrutiny would keep him sharp, honest, and vigilant. Lila reminded him, every public challenge is also an opportunity. If you navigate this correctly, you'll rebuild not just your business, but your reputation. Meanwhile, the team monitored the market response. Ethan's company had seen small but significant upticks in engagement. Partners who had once distanced themselves were cautiously reaching out again. Employees, many of whom had stayed loyal through the crisis, were energized by the visible momentum and the clarity of vision that Ethan now embodied. That evening, Ethan sat alone in the office, the city skyline glowing beyond the windows. He reflected on the whirlwind of the past week. The public exposure, the intense scrutiny, the victories and setbacks. The spotlight was no longer a threat, it was a tool. It could shape perception, attract allies, and remind him daily of the stakes. And yet, he knew he had to remain grounded. This comeback wasn't about headlines, it was about sustainable progress, relationships, and regaining control over a life once defined by reckless ambition. As he prepared to leave, a text from Clara appeared. Saw the interview. Proud of you. Remember to breathe. He smiled, realizing that support from trusted allies mattered as much as public perception. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, tougher negotiations, and unpredictable market forces. But tonight, Ethan allowed himself a quiet moment of triumph. A small, hard-earned victory in a comeback story that was only just beginning. The morning started like any other, with Ethan reviewing financial projections and responding to emails, but a subtle tension hung in the air. Something felt off. Marcus, normally calm and methodical, kept glancing at his phone, frowning at every incoming notification. Lila, equally concerned, whispered about unusual activity in one of the investment accounts. Ethan, focused on rebuilding trust with investors, initially brushed it aside, assuming it was a minor glitch, until the call came from one of the company's largest partners. Ethan, we have a problem, the partner said, voice tight. There's been a major withdrawal. A significant sum has moved overnight, and the transactions look suspicious. Can you explain this? Ethan's stomach dropped. His mind raced, recalling every meeting, every handshake, every agreement that had led to this moment. He asked Marcus to trace the transactions immediately. As the data populated, the truth hit like a freight train. Someone on the inside had betrayed him. An old ally, someone Ethan had trusted implicitly, had siphoned a considerable portion of the remaining capital, exploiting the chaos of the public scrutiny and market uncertainty. Shock quickly turned into resolve. Ethan's pulse accelerated, not with fear, but with determination. We find them, he told Marcus and Lila, voice steady but firm. And we make sure this doesn't just disappear quietly. Transparency is part of our recovery, and anyone who jeopardizes that trust will face consequences. The investigation unfolded like a high-stakes chess game. Emails were traced, transactions followed, and phone records examined. With each piece of evidence, the betrayal became clearer. Someone close, someone he had relied on to navigate the company through turbulent waters, had gambled on their own gain over the collective future. Ethan realized the magnitude, not just financial but symbolic. Trust, once shattered, was difficult to rebuild. Yet he refused to let anger cloud his judgment. He called the culprit into his office. The room was heavy with tension. The accused, a former confidant, attempted excuses, citing personal debts and market pressures. Ethan listened, eyes narrowing but calm. Then he spoke. You knew what was at stake. You knew this was a moment for rebuilding, not exploiting. What you did isn't just a financial crime, it's a betrayal of everything this company stands for. The consequences were swift. Legal action was initiated, public statements carefully crafted, and the partner networks reassured that Ethan's leadership remained intact. But the personal blow lingered. Betrayal cut deeper than loss of money, it struck at the core of his instincts, the relationships he had nurtured, and the very foundation of trust he needed to rebuild both his company and his life. Yet, in the midst of chaos, a strange clarity emerged. The betrayal reinforced a lesson Ethan had learned in the past weeks. Control over external events was limited, but control over response was absolute. He doubled down on transparency, holding an all-hands meeting with employees. We've faced a betrayal, he admitted, but it doesn't define us. It defines the actions we take next. We will rebuild stronger, smarter, and with integrity that cannot be compromised. By nightfall, the immediate crisis was contained, and Ethan allowed himself a brief moment to breathe. He sat in his office, the city lights flickering through the windows, reflecting off the polished surfaces. Betrayal had tested him, shaken him, but it had also solidified his priorities. Wealth, reputation, even survival, it all meant less than the resilience, accountability, and leadership he was building for the future. As he prepared to leave, Lila placed a hand on his shoulder. "They'll try again," she warned softly. Ethan nodded, not with fear but with anticipation. The road ahead was perilous, but now he had seen both the worst of human greed and the strength of his own resolve. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but one truth remained: Ethan Carver would not falter. He would rise, and he would ensure that every step forward was grounded in the lessons learned from loss, exposure, and betrayal. The next morning, Ethan arrived at the office with a sense of cautious optimism. The betrayal had been exposed, the legal action initiated, and the internal network secured, but he knew the recovery wasn't just about damage control, it was about rebuilding momentum, trust, and alliances. Yet, as he settled into his desk, a subtle ping alerted him to an unexpected visitor. A message from someone he hadn't spoken to in years. It was Camille Torres, a former tech partner whose startup Ethan had once invested in, a woman whose brilliance had been matched only by her discretion. The message was concise. "Heard about the storm. I can help. Meet me at the cafe on 5th at noon." Curiosity and a spark of hope stirred within him. Camille had always been strategic, insightful, and brutally honest. If she offered assistance, it wasn't out of pity, it was a calculated move, one that might provide a way to stabilize the chaos that had consumed Ethan's world. At the cafe, the meeting began with cautious pleasantries, but Camille wasted no time. "Ethan, I know the accounts, I know the networks, and I know the players who can turn the tide for you," she said, eyes sharp and unwavering. "But this isn't a charity. You need resources, I need assurance that this will be executed with precision." Ethan leaned forward, absorbing every word. He understood that Camille wasn't just offering a lifeline. She was offering leverage, an opportunity to regain control of his empire with insight he hadn't considered. "I'm all in," he said, voice steady. "Whatever it takes to recover, I'll commit." They spent hours strategizing, mapping out the vulnerabilities exposed by the betrayal and crafting a multi-tiered plan to regain investor confidence, shore up assets, and implement safeguards against future threats. Camille's approach was surgical, meticulous, and yet adaptable, a stark contrast to Ethan's earlier reactive tactics. She emphasized transparency with investors, while quietly leveraging relationships to secure bridge funding and restore operational stability. As the day wore on, Ethan felt a renewed sense of purpose. Camille wasn't just a professional ally, her presence was a reminder that resilience was often fueled by connections forged in the past. She challenged him, pushed him to think beyond immediate losses, and encouraged calculated risks that might accelerate the recovery. Later, walking back to his office, Ethan reflected on the irony. Months ago he had believed he was alone in his empire, that the weight of failure rested solely on his shoulders. Now, alliances long dormant began to re-emerge. Trust, carefully rebuilt, became a weapon against uncertainty. He realized that vulnerability didn't signal weakness, it was the catalyst for collaboration. Back in his office, he drafted a memo to his remaining executives and key investors. The message was clear: we faced betrayal. We survived. We are rebuilding with a foundation stronger than before. Leadership, transparency, and strategic partnerships will guide us through this next chapter. By nightfall, Camille left, confident that Ethan had the determination and discipline to follow through. Alone in the office, Ethan allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. He poured a glass of whiskey, staring out at the city skyline, the same skyline that had once symbolized unshakable power, now a canvas for reinvention. He knew the coming days would test him further. Market forces, media scrutiny, and internal skepticism were all challenges that couldn't be ignored. Yet with Camille's guidance, the betrayal sting now seemed like a necessary trial, a crucible forging a more strategic, resilient leader. For the first time since that catastrophic day, Ethan felt a flicker of hope, a hope grounded not in luck or fortune, but in clarity, planning, and a rekindled network of allies. As he closed the blinds and prepared to leave, Ethan whispered to himself, "This isn't the end. It's the beginning of a comeback the world won't forget." The morning air was crisp and electric as Ethan prepared for his first public step since the collapse. The city buzzed below the penthouse, oblivious to the storm that had threatened to consume his empire. Today wasn't about secrecy or private deals, it was about reclaiming his narrative. He would show investors, the media, and competitors alike that losing everything had not broken him, it had sharpened him. Camille had been relentless in her coaching. Confidence is contagious, she had reminded him. You need to appear unshakable even when you feel every fracture beneath the surface. Your message has to be clear, recovery is underway and control is back in your hands. Ethan arrived at the press conference early, surrounded by the towering glass and steel of the financial district. Reporters adjusted cameras, whispered into microphones and exchanged speculative glances. This wasn't just about the numbers, it was about perception. And perception could make or break the fragile trust he was working to rebuild. As he stepped to the podium, he felt the familiar tension, the heartbeat that came with high stakes. But it was different now. It wasn't fear, it was resolve. He looked out over the sea of cameras, each lens a reminder of the public eye, the scrutiny that had magnified his fall. And yet, there was opportunity in every gaze. "Good morning," he began, voice steady but carrying the weight of authenticity. "I am here today not to dwell on the past, but to share the path forward. Yes, I faced unexpected betrayal. Yes, there were missteps. But the true measure of leadership is not how we avoid failure, it's how we respond to it." The reporters scribbled, flashed, and murmured, but Ethan continued, pacing lightly as he outlined the plan Camille had helped him craft. Transparent restructuring, immediate stabilization of key assets, and partnerships designed to restore investor confidence, all presented with clarity and undeniable conviction. Then he shifted the focus. "I've learned that an empire isn't just numbers, contracts, or influence. It's people, it's trust, and it's resilience. I've relied on those who stood with me when the storm hit, and together, we are rebuilding stronger than before." Questions came fast and sharp, probing the collapse, the financial holes, and the mysterious partners who had caused the fall. Ethan answered each with precision, never defensive, always strategic. Every pause, every emphasis, conveyed authority without arrogance, transparency without weakness. By the end of the hour, the atmosphere had shifted. Skepticism had transformed into cautious respect. Analysts nodded, reporters scribbled with renewed interest, and whispers of a comeback began to circulate like wildfire across social media feeds. Hashtags like #EthanRises and #ComebackCEO trended almost immediately, signaling that the narrative was no longer about downfall, it was about resurgence. Back at his office, Ethan allowed himself a rare moment to breathe. Camille appeared, smiling faintly, a quiet acknowledgement of a mission accomplished. "They're watching," she said simply. "And they're listening." Ethan poured himself a drink, the amber liquid catching the light as he reflected on the journey. Losing everything had been devastating, yes, but it had also clarified what mattered: strategy, trust, and human connection. The public reclamation was not just about saving the company, it was about proving to himself that he could rise from the ashes stronger, wiser, and more resilient than ever before. By nightfall, the city seemed smaller, less intimidating. The skyline, once a symbol of power that could be stolen, now felt like a canvas of possibility. Ethan knew there would be battles ahead, legal entanglements, internal power struggles, media scrutiny, but tonight the tide had turned. He glanced at his phone, messages of cautious congratulations from investors, a few supportive notes from old allies, and a single text from Camille: "The storm has passed. Now comes the rebuilding. Are you ready?" Ethan smiled, a deep, steady grin. "I've never been more ready." The early morning sun cast long shadows across the skyline, golden light spilling into Ethan's newly reopened office. Today wasn't about nostalgia or regret, it was about execution, clarity, and reclaiming the life he had fought so hard to rebuild. The city was awake, the markets buzzing, and he felt an unfamiliar but exhilarating sense of alignment. For the first time since the collapse, he wasn't reacting to events, he was shaping them. Ethan walked through the floors of his company, now humming with renewed energy. Teams that had once doubted, investors who had once questioned his judgment, and partners who had once abandoned him were now part of a carefully coordinated effort to stabilize, innovate, and grow. Every conversation he had, every decision he made, reflected the lessons learned from the day he lost it all. He paused outside the conference room where his leadership team had gathered. Faces that had been tense with uncertainty now mirrored cautious optimism. Camille approached, a knowing smile on her face. "It's done," she said quietly. "You've reclaimed control. Not just of the company but of the story." Ethan nodded, feeling the weight of her words. Losing everything had been the crucible in which his true capabilities were forged. The collapse had stripped away ego, entitlement, and pretense, revealing the core of his character: strategic brilliance tempered by humility, resilience, and the recognition that no empire exists without people. Later that day, the media caught wind of the turnaround. Headlines shifted overnight, from tales of scandal and failure to narratives of resilience, ingenuity, and comeback. Public sentiment swung dramatically, with analysts praising Ethan's leadership and investors quietly repositioning their confidence in his ventures. Even his competitors seemed to regard him with a new level of respect, recognizing that this was a man who could fall harder than most and yet rise stronger than any. But the most profound moment wasn't in the boardroom or in news articles. It was in the quiet of his apartment later that evening. Ethan sank into the sofa, phone buzzing with congratulatory messages, yet he set it aside to reflect. He thought about the frantic, chaotic day when everything had seemed lost, when the empire he had spent decades building collapsed in hours. That day had been painful, terrifying, and lonely, but it had also been clarifying. He had learned the impermanence of wealth, the fragility of trust, and the incredible power of resilience. For the first time, he allowed himself to consider the future without fear. There was no obsession with appearances, no desperation to prove dominance. Instead, he understood that true wealth was measured not in bank accounts, but in trust earned, relationships nurtured, and integrity maintained. He envisioned initiatives he had shelved, partnerships he had abandoned, and creative ideas that had seemed too risky. Now, with clarity born from catastrophe, he saw a path forward that was both ambitious and grounded. Ethan leaned back, closing his eyes, and allowed a deep breath to settle through him. The city hummed around him, alive with possibility, reflecting a world that, like him, could recover and thrive after upheaval. He thought about the team that had stood by him, the mentors who had offered guidance, and the few loyal friends who had reminded him of who he was when he had doubted himself most. Every setback had been a teacher, every loss a lens for perspective, and every moment of fear a catalyst for growth. As night fell, he turned to the skyline, lights glittering like constellations. He had been stripped bare, yet here he stood, rebuilt, resilient, and unbroken. The lessons of loss would guide his decisions, infuse his leadership with empathy, and anchor his ambition in wisdom. Ethan realized the most profound victory wasn't the restoration of his wealth, it was the reclamation of himself. And in that quiet triumph he smiled. The storm had passed. The empire had survived. But more importantly, he had survived, and emerged stronger and wiser than ever before. The world could challenge him again, throw new crises his way, but now he knew this truth. Losing everything was not the end, it was the beginning of something greater. Ethan whispered to himself, almost reverently, "I'm ready for whatever comes next." And in that declaration he truly was.